Hi class, welcome to our second part lecture on chapter 4 in AP Environmental Science. First part of this lecture was about climate and how different climates in different parts of the world are created by a variety of factors, including energy from the sun, tilt of the earth, how that energy is transferred into the air and into the water is all responsible for creating many different climates that we see on our planet today. Now, all these different climates lead to areas where specific organisms, plants, animals, different amounts of precipitation, different variable temperatures, consistent temperatures, all of that stuff leads to what we call biomes. Now, you might notice that I've started on aquatic biomes. That's because we're skipping, in terms of the lecture portion, the terrestrial biomes. They are still available in the PowerPoint, but we're going to do an activity during the week where we're going to explore the terrestrial biomes in class and on our own time that doesn't involve a long lecture, just talking about temperature and precipitation amounts and common grasses and organisms found. We are going to focus on the aquatic biomes because our next couple of topics are going to involve water resources and water use, as well as water pollution. So you can see here that typical aquatic biomes, how we categorize them, is usually based on salinity, whether it's freshwater or saltwater, the amount of depth, and that's important because whether or not we are going to find photosynthetic organisms, more, less, none, and water flow in terms of is it constant water flow or is it stagnant water flow. So our first little foray is going to be looking at streams and rivers. And streams and rivers are fairly common. We have a pretty good understanding of what streams and rivers are. Basically, where that water is coming from, it is flowing fresh water, so it is moving from point A to point B. We know that one of the two ways that most streams or rivers begin, or continue at least, is that they begin at underground springs, basically large pools of water underground that eventually move and make their way to the surface where they become running water. Or a lot of times rivers and streams can have their major input from melting snow or rain that runs off from various landscapes and structures. The only difference between a stream and a river is that a stream is more narrow and a river is usually wider, and they can obviously house a variety of freshwater fish, insects, bacteria. Here we see a picture of the Rocky River near Cleveland, Ohio, and we see that it is flowing fresh water. Gravity is helping to move that fresh water from its original source. And again, we can have a variety of different organisms that can survive in this freshwater environment. Now, lakes and ponds are our other freshwater environment, or one of our other freshwater biomes, but the difference is that they are standing water, meaning it's not free-flowing. Now, because it is standing water, they are able to support a larger number of organisms because of the fact that there is more things like vegetation can hold on to. And if you have vegetation, if you have photosynthetic organisms, those things can support more life. The only difference between a lake and a pond is that a lake is larger than a pond, but there's no real clear point at where we would say this isn't a pond versus this is a lake. One of the more famous ones or bigger ones that people around here know is Lake George. It's a very popular tourist destination in New York State. It's a very large, massive lake, and we can see that it is standing water. It's filled from runoff and from rainfall. And we can see that because it is standing along the edges, we have a large amount of vegetation that can be supported. Now, over here on the right side, your basic diagram of a lake is broken up into 4 different zones. We have these zones where we have plants are able to anchor into the soil, and we have a lot of we have some anchoring grasses, shrubs, trees that are able to anchor into the soil in that lake. We have our zone where we're going to be able to find photosynthetic organisms like algae and phytoplankton. We have our zone that down here, and we'll define these all on the next page, where we don't see any light. Light is not able to make its way through, and this can vary depending on the contents of the lake, how much sediments, dirts, things like, waste even can affect how far the light can actually disperse its way into a lake. And then we have the actual bedrock or the soil at the bottom of the lake. And we have our 4 different names for these zones: the littoral zone, the limnetic zone, the profundal zone, and the benthic zone. And so what you need to know about these is that the littoral zone is basically our shallow area of the soil where water can grow. Good way to remember this is that the littoral zone is where litter comes from, like tree litter, leaves, dead grass, things like that. So the litter comes from the littoral zone. Our limnetic zone is where the light can actually shine. So basically, photosynthetic organisms can survive in the limnetic zone because that's the only place where the light can penetrate through the water, but it's also not along the shore, so you're not going to find rooted plants. You're going to find phytoplankton. You're going to find algae. You're going to find things that are basically floating in or at near the top of the water. And obviously, the things that are going to survive better are the things that are closer to the top because they are closer to the sun, and they want to get as much sunlight as they can for photosynthesis. The profundal zone is basically the darkness zone, and the darkness zone basically where sunlight can't survive, producers can't live there. You find a lot of bottom feeders because, again, it is near the bottom. That will feed off of the dead stuff that sinks down to the bottom. Tends to be a lot less living material or living things down here as opposed to in a limnetic zone of a body of water because, again, high productivity and low productivity. And then your benthic zone is basically the muddy bottom. You might find a lot of detritivores, snails, things that like to break down organic matter near the bottom in the benthic zone, just basically burying and living in the mud down there. So those are our open bodies of water. Another freshwater biome is what we call a wetland. And a wetland is basically defined by either being submerged or at least filled with water for at least part of each year, meaning that at some point it is flooded, basically. But the vegetation there is actually able to survive year-round, even though it's an area that's partially flooded. Basically, it's shallow enough where even when it is flooded, these organisms, these plant materials can still survive. Wetlands are very important because what they're really good at doing is filtering out and absorbing. The plants that are adapted to wetlands are very good survivors, and these survivors are able to basically live for a very long period of time. And wetlands, serve a natural purpose as basically a natural filter. They're able to take in any kind of waste runoff, and they basically can absorb it, and those plant materials can hold it in without really being affected much because they're so used to being able to survive in tough conditions. So we have a couple of different things: swamps, marshes, bogs. They are all fairly different in terms of what they're able to do and how they're able to survive. So here we see a swamp in Illinois. Swamps are really, really nutrient rich. They have a lot of the soil that where swamps are able to be found is very rich and very full of nutrients. So we can see that this swamp here is actually able to support solid woody tree life. Over here in picture B, this is a marsh. Now, a marsh is not going to be as nutrient rich, but it is going to be able to support things like grasses, sedges, cattails here. So it's a marsh is basically a wetland that can support non-woody, meaning tree-like vegetation. So we have the lily pads that are able to grow here. We have the sedges, we have the cattails. These are common plants for marshes. And down here we have a bog. Bogs are not really good at growing things, but you look at this and you say, well, why is there so much vegetation down here? The only difference between a bog and a marsh is that this soil is going to be more acidic, have a lot less nutrients than a marsh might. But why is there so much stuff growing here? Well, this is a niche. This is a place where organisms can survive. And what we have here is a couple of different grasses dominated by what's called sphagnum moss. This is in Wisconsin here. And it's able to support itself in this environment, this moss, and these different kinds of sedges because it's adapted to the acidic soil that's in this bog. Now, whereas most plants would not be able to survive because there isn't enough nutrients, the soil is too acidic, these plants found this niche and they were able to survive and adapt to it and have been able to basically fill it out, a space where other living things could not. But this area is not typically good for a lot of other different kinds of plants to grow. Now, a salt marsh is where is a wetland as well, but it's also mostly found along the coastline. And these coastlines will usually consist of, when we're talking about coastlines here, this one is in Plum Island Sound in Massachusetts. They're highly productive because they're in fairly, seasonal temperate areas. This one in Massachusetts. They don't contain woody vegetation, so it's only growing grasses for the most part. And they're very, very productive because of the fact that they can, where this mixing is occurring of salt water and fresh water, they can survive and tolerate it. And that mixing is going to really churn up a lot of nutrients because a lot of, we have a really nutrient-rich organic matter. We have a lot of things where plants and algae can just basically take nutrients in from mixing with fresh water and salt water from all these different sources before it makes its way into the open ocean. So a lot of these sounds, bays, that, any kind of salt marsh that can grow along it, they're really productive because there's just so much available material there for them to grow. Now, a mangrove swamp is another type of aquatic biome. They're salt-tolerant trees, basically, meaning that they are trees, they are woody material, but they can survive in salt water. They're adapted to not deal with the salt. They're very important in terms of an ecosystem resource. They prevent coastlines from eroding. They're good at preventing storm damage from storm surge. They hold the soil in place. They provide shelter for young living organisms to be able to survive down in the roots. Fish hatcheries, natural fish hatcheries. We're not talking about man-made ones here, but where fish are able to basically spawn, attach their young to the roots of these trees for them to grow and develop. They provide a safe haven for that to happen and protect them from larger predators. Now, as we're starting to work our way into saltwater, we're going to start talking about a couple of saltwater biomes, and one highly specific one is called the intertidal zone. Now, intertidal zone literally means between the tides, and it's basically just a rocky area of the shore that exists where it's covered with water in high tide and it's open to the air in low tide. So the organisms that live here need to be able to do a couple of things. They need to be able to hold on to things. So we see a lot of sessile organisms like barnacles, starfish, things that are able to grab and hold on without getting really flung around from the crashing waves. They have to basically have a hard outer exterior, like we see the starfish here, we see all these barnacles, because they basically need a way to protect themselves when there isn't any water from drying out. And they need to be able to, so they need to be able to hold on, they need to be able to not dry out, and they need to be able to basically get enough nutrients and food from the water when it comes in and use that to survive for a long enough period of time. So it is a very highly specific, highly adapted group of organisms that can survive in this intertidal zone. Now, coral reefs are a big one. There was an FRQ on coral reefs a couple of years ago, specifically talking about the issues associated with coral bleaching. Now, the quick summary of what a coral is, because a lot of people get very confused on what a coral is. A coral is a consumer. It's an animal. But it's basically a giant hollow tube organism. What makes corals unique is that within this hollow tube, you find algae, and they have a very symbiotic relationship. So the coral takes in carbonates and uses it to make carbonate from the water and uses it to produce a hard shell, and it provides housing for itself and for the algae that it's a symbiotic relationship with. Now, when it takes in dead organic material, it consumes it and breaks it down and produces carbon dioxide. Well, we know that algae and other producers need carbon dioxide to survive, so the algae in the coral actually absorbs that carbon dioxide and uses it to produce sugar that the coral itself can then use. So there's a very nice symbiotic relationship here. And then since the coral is a highly productive area because of all the photosynthesis happening with that algae, it colonizes into these large, beautiful structures that we see that allow for many other organisms, other producers to colonize. And then, of course, if we have a large enough amount of producers in a sessile area underwater, we're going to get a large amount of trophic feeding, small fish to large fish. And that's why coral reefs are held so widely, because they really are these specific niche things in oceans that basically create an entire saltwater environment. So why do we care so much about coral reefs? Well, this process of coral bleaching, when the algae itself dies, and it could be because of a number of other things, disease, environmental change like pH, salt concentration, toxins, anything that could cause the algae to dry would lead to the loss of color in that coral. And so the coral itself is dying because, again, it can't get any sugar. So if the coral is dying and breaking and the algae isn't producing sugar, then the organisms that rely on it for food are also going to die with it, which is why coral bleaching can have a massive impact on the ecosystems where we find corals and coral reefs. And then the last aquatic biome is just open ocean. In open ocean, we can basically summarize as where does the light go, our photic zone, versus the deeper water where we can't get sufficient light, the aphotic zone. So the only real thing we need to know about open ocean is that in the photic zone, you have enough production, and this is where we tend to find a lot of our fish that feed on phytoplankton, smaller fish, larger fish that would feed on them. In the aphotic zone, we have a lot of organisms that feed on larger fish, but are not going to go near the surface where they might get hunted because they're too big. So our aphotic zone will have a lot of organisms that are well adapted to the darkness, to the darker area. And then we will have some organisms down here that can be producers, but they're not photosynthetic producers. They're chemosynthetic, meaning that they'll take methane and hydrogen sulfide from thermal vents and use that to create a compound that they can basically use to feed off of, basically create their own version of a carbon source from taking in methane and hydrogen sulfide, whereas most photosynthetic organisms are taking in CO2 here and using oxygen to break that down. And those are in here we see. So you can see that the photic zone of open ocean is really not that big. It's only a couple hundred meters as opposed to the rest of the aphotic zone. And again, we do have a benthic zone, obviously, a seafloor. And then down here we see we have a nice illustration of those thermal vents where bacteria would be able to take that methane and that carbon dioxide. So these are really our aquatic biomes. So we'll spend more time talking about different aquatic biomes as we talk about water waste, water use, water pollution. And as far as the terrestrial biomes are concerned, we're going to leave it at, we're going to work on those things in class and talk about some of the specific things we need. So that's been our part 2 lecture of chapter 4. Hope you've enjoyed it and hope you enjoy a nice weekend before I see you all on Monday.